On a grey morning in the spring of the year, she turned 91. A woman named Margaret Ellison was buried in a plain pine casket, in a cemetery on the edge of a manufacturing town that had long since forgotten she existed. 6 people came. A neighbour, a great-niece, the girl who delivered her groceries, and 3 men in dark suits who had driven up from the company, not because they had known her, but because their lawyers had told them they had to be there. None of the 3 men in suits had ever spoken to her. One of them, the chief executive of the company, had walked past her desk roughly 4,000 times across his career, and had, on perhaps a dozen of those occasions, handed her his empty coffee cup without looking up from the papers in his hand. He did not know her last name. He was about to learn it. He was about to learn it in a way that would follow him for the rest of his life. Because 3 weeks after that funeral, in a wood-panelled conference room she had never once been permitted to enter, a lawyer opened a folder, cleared his throat, and began to read the contents of Margaret Ellison's estate aloud. And as he read, the most powerful men in that company sat very, very still. The typist they had paid $80 a week. The woman whose name they could not remember had died owning more of their company than all of them combined. She had never earned more than a clerk's wage. She had never been promoted, she had never been thanked. And across 51 quiet years, with nobody watching and nobody asking, she had assembled one of the largest individual positions in the entire company, hiding in plain sight 3 desks from the boardroom door. This is the story of how she did it, and what it can teach the rest of us. To understand Margaret Ellison, you first have to understand the town. It was the kind of American town that the 20th century built and then abandoned. A few thousand people, a river, a railhead, and one enormous brick factory that employed nearly everyone who lived there. The company made industrial components, valves, fittings, fasteners, the unglamorous metal pieces that hold the machinery of a nation together. It had been founded in the 1890s by a family that still ran it. It paid a fair wage for its time, and it understood something that many companies of that era understood, and that almost no company today remembers: that a worker who owns a piece of the company will work differently than a worker who does not. Margaret was born in that town in the early 1920s, the daughter of a machinist who worked the factory floor and a mother who took in sewing. She was a careful, observant, intensely private child. The kind of girl who noticed everything and said almost nothing. She was very good at exactly 2 things. She could type faster than anyone the school had ever seen, and she could keep a secret forever. Her father worked the floor of that factory for 31 years, and her father taught her something on the porch of their small house, on an evening she would remember for the rest of her life. He told her that the men who ran the company did not get rich from their salaries. They got rich, he said, because they owned the company. The wage, he told her, is what they pay you to show up. The ownership is where the real money lives. And ownership, he said, is the one thing they will sometimes hand you cheap, because they assume you are too poor, or too tired, or too small to ever hold on to it. Margaret never forgot it. She filed it away, the way she filed everything, in the quiet, orderly, patient place behind her watchful eyes. And when she was 19 years old, she put on her one good dress, walked down the hill to the factory's front office, and applied for a job as a typist. She would hold a desk in that building for the next 51 years. Margaret Ellison started in the typing pool in 1941, a long room of women at identical desks, transcribing letters and invoices, and shipping orders for a wage that came to about $80 a week in the money of the years that followed. $80 a week. Hold that number. We will come back to it again and again, because $80 a week is the entire engine of this story. She was good. She was faster, more accurate, and more discreet than the women around her, and within a few years she was pulled out of the pool and given a desk of her own, just outside the executive offices on the top floor. The desk that handled the private correspondence of the men who ran the company. The desk 3 doors from the boardroom. And from that desk, for the next 4 decades, Margaret Ellison saw everything. She typed the board minutes. She typed the dividend announcements before they were public. She typed the letters to shareholders. the memos about expansions, the confidential notes about which divisions were thriving and which were quietly being saved. She was, in the language of the era, invisible. The executives spoke freely in front of her, the way a man speaks freely in front of his furniture. They forgot she was in the room. They forgot she could read. They forgot she had a machinist father who had told her, on a porch at dusk, exactly where the real money lived. She watched the company grow. She watched it pay its dividend, quarter after quarter, year after year, in good times and in lean ones. She watched the executives around her buy boats and lake houses and second cars, and complain in front of her that it was never quite enough. And she watched something else too. She watched the men at the top quietly accumulate shares of the company every chance they got, through options, through grants, through purchases, because they, of course, understood exactly what her father had understood. The wage is what they pay you to show up. The ownership is where the real money lives. Margaret Ellison did not envy them. That is the thing that almost nobody understands about people like her. She did not want the boat. She did not want the lake house. She wanted the one thing the boat and the lake house were quietly draining away from the men who bought them. She wanted the ownership, and she had already begun very quietly to get it. There is a detail about her position that I think reveals her completely, because she typed the company's confidential documents. Margaret knew things about the business that no ordinary shareholder could ever know. She knew before the public did which quarters would be strong. She knew when a dividend was about to be raised. She knew when a competitor was struggling and when an expansion was coming. And here is the remarkable thing. She never once acted on any of it. She did not trade on the secrets that crossed her desk. She did not buy extra before good news or sell before bad. She simply bought the same fixed amount every single week, forever, regardless of what she knew. Not because she was a saint about securities law, though she was scrupulous, but because she had understood something deeper than any single quarter's results. The secrets did not matter, the decades did. No piece of inside information could ever be worth more than simply never selling. The men around her who also knew these secrets used them constantly, timing their personal trades to the information that crossed their desks, convinced that their edge was knowledge. And across the decades, their clever, well-informed timing underperformed the strategy of a woman who simply refused to do anything at all. That is not a coincidence. It is one of the most reliable findings in all of finance. The more often you act on what you know, the more chances you give yourself to be wrong, to be taxed, to be scared out at the bottom. Margaret's edge was the opposite of theirs. Her edge was inaction. She turned not doing anything into the single most profitable activity of her entire life. Here is how it began. In the years after the war, the company, like many American firms of that era, offered its employees a stock purchase plan. You could have a small amount taken out of every paycheck automatically, and the company would use it to buy you shares of its own stock, often at a slight discount. To the men on the factory floor, this was a joke, a trick. Why would a man earning a working wage hand part of it back to the company that paid it? Most of them declined. They wanted the cash. They had families and bills and 100 reasons that were all completely understandable. And the executives liked it that way, because every share the workers declined was a share that stayed available for the people who understood what it was worth. The stock the workers laughed at was the same stock the men in the corner offices were quietly stuffing into their own accounts. Margaret Ellison signed up on the first day the plan was offered. She took the maximum the plan allowed, a few dollars from every single paycheck week after week automatically before the money could ever reach her hands. On $80 a week it hurt. She ate plainly. She mended her own clothes. She lived in 2 rented rooms for the first 20 years and a small board house for the rest. She did not take vacations. She did not marry. She put the gap between what she earned and what she allowed herself to spend, into the stock of the company. Every week for 51 years, And then she did the one thing that separated her from every other person in that building. She never ever sold. Now I want to make the mechanism completely concrete, because the magic here is not magic. It is arithmetic, run for an inhuman length of time. When the company paid its quarterly dividend, Margaret did not take the cash. She had enrolled in the reinvestment plan, which meant every dividend she earned was automatically used to buy more shares of the company. Those new shares then paid their own dividends the next quarter, which bought more shares, which paid more dividends. On and on, 4 times a year for half a century. In a loop she never once interrupted. In the early years, this was almost invisible. A few extra shares a quarter, a rounding error. For the first 10 years, Margaret Ellison's position was small enough that, had any executive ever bothered to look, he would have laughed at it, the way the men on the floor had laughed at the pamphlet. But Margaret was not investing for 10 years. Margaret had heard her father on the porch. Margaret was investing for the rest of her natural life. I want to linger on what that sacrifice actually cost her, because it is easy to say the words "she lived below her means" and let them slide past you like water. On $80 a week, putting away the maximum the plan allowed meant Margaret Ellison felt every dollar of it. It meant a winter coat worn 10 years past the point any of her co-workers would have replaced it. It meant a single pair of good shoes resoled twice. It meant a furnished room with a shared bathroom down the hall when women her age were beginning to buy little houses of their own. It meant no honeymoon because there was no wedding. And we will never fully know how much of that was choice and how much was arithmetic. But here is the thing you have to understand about Margaret. She did not experience this as deprivation. She experienced it as ownership. Every dollar she did not spend on a coat was a dollar that became a sliver of a company that would pay her and her cause for the rest of time. There is a question that always comes up at exactly this point, and it deserves an honest answer. Was she simply lucky? Did she happen to work for the one company whose stock went to the moon? And would the whole strategy have collapsed if she had worked somewhere else? And the honest answer is the company mattered, but less than you would think. Her firm was not a rocket. It was a boring, profitable, dividend-paying industrial business. The kind of company that grows a few % a year, raises its dividend a little most years, and survives. It was eventually absorbed into a larger conglomerate that was itself boring and profitable and dividend-paying. The thing that made Margaret rich was not a miracle stock. It was an ordinary stock, held for an extraordinary time, with every dividend reinvested and not a single share ever sold. The company was the soil. The patience was the tree. Across 51 years, the stock market did what the stock market always does. It rose and it crashed, and it rose again, and it crashed again. And each time it crashed, the experts swore it would never recover, and each time it recovered. And Margaret Ellison, at her desk 3 doors from the boardroom, sat through every single one of them without selling a share. She sat through the sharp recession of the 1950s. She sat through the long, grinding bear market of the 1970s, with its oil shocks and its double-digit inflation and its endless headlines about the death of American industry. She watched the value of her position, the position she had bled $80 paychecks to build, fall by nearly half, and she did nothing. She clipped no panic, she made no call. She kept buying her few shares a week, because the falling price simply meant her automatic purchases bought more shares for the same money. The crash, to a patient buyer, is a sale. She watched the executives around her behave very differently. During the worst of the 70s, several of the senior men, frightened, leveraged, overextended on the boats and the lake houses, quietly sold large blocks of their own company stock to cover their lifestyles. They sold near the bottom. They sold the ownership. They kept the wage and they kept the boat, and they let go of the one thing that would have made them genuinely rich. Margaret Ellison, typing their sell orders for them, said nothing. She simply kept buying what they were selling. Think about the symmetry of that for a moment. The men at the top, who understood ownership well enough to accumulate it in the good years, did not have the temperament to hold it through the bad ones. And the typists they ignored, who had nothing but temperament, held everything. In the end, this story is not really about money at all. It is about who can sit still when the world is screaming at them to move. Margaret Ellison could sit still, better than any executive who ever handed her a coffee cup. And then came the long boom. The market that had terrified everyone in the 70s turned, in the decades that followed, into one of the greatest sustained expansions in financial history. The company grew, it was acquired, spun off, restructured, and finally folded into a much larger conglomerate. And at every stage, the shares Margaret Ellison held were exchanged for shares of the bigger and bigger entity that absorbed it. Her ownership did not shrink in those deals. It rode straight up the elevator, floor after floor, decade after decade, compounding the entire way. I want you to sit with one particular afternoon, because the lawyer who settled her estate told it to me, and I have not been able to forget it. It was a bad day in the worst year of the 1970s. The company's stock had fallen for the 11th straight session. The corridor outside the executive offices was tense and quiet, the way a corridor gets when frightened, powerful men are deciding things behind closed doors. And one of the senior vice presidents came out of the boardroom, walked to Margaret's desk, and asked her to type up an order selling a very large block of his personal shares. He was getting out, he told her, while he still could. The whole thing, he said, might be finished. Margaret typed his sell order, cleanly, accurately, without a word of comment, the way she had typed 10,000 documents before it. And then she went home that night to her rented room, opened her own ledger under the lamp, and bought more. Not despite the crash, because of it. The same falling price that was terrifying the vice president into selling was, to Margaret, a discount. Her automatic weekly purchase simply bought more shares that week than it had the week before. The man with the title sold his ownership at the bottom to protect his lifestyle. The woman with the ledger bought his fear, one cheap share at a time. 30 years later, those were some of the most valuable shares she owned. This is the part of the story that I find almost unbearably instructive. The crash did not test her intelligence. It tested her stomach, and the men who out-earned her by 100 to 1, who had degrees and titles and corner offices, failed that test again and again, while a typist with a tin of lunch passed it every single time. Wealth, it turns out, is not distributed to the smartest people in the building. It is distributed to the people who can keep their hands still, when everyone around them is reaching for the panic button. Let us do the math out loud, because when the lawyer finally read these numbers in that boardroom, not one executive in the room believed them at first. Suppose Margaret put away the equivalent of $15 a week into company stock across her career, scaling up modestly as the years passed. Suppose the stock, with its dividends reinvested, compounded at roughly 10 to 11% a year, which is close to the long-run return of strong American equities across the 20th century. And suppose she did this without interruption for 51 years. The terminal number in that scenario lands somewhere between $7 and $12 million. On a typist's wage. And this is the part that genuinely breaks people's intuition, so I am going to slow down and say it carefully. Of those millions, only a tiny fraction came from the money Margaret actually deducted from her paychecks. Her total lifetime contributions might have added up to $40,000 or $50,000 across half a century. Everything else, every other dollar of those millions, was created by time, by reinvested dividends buying shares that bought more shares, by compounding running undisturbed for longer than most people's entire adult lives. Now compare her to the men who ran the company. A chief executive in that era might have drawn 50, 80, 100 times Margaret's salary. He accumulated stock too, far more than she ever could, far faster. But here is what undid him. He sold. He sold in the 70s to cover his life. He sold when he retired to buy a bigger house. He sold to diversify, to spend, to live the life his title told him he was owed. Each sale felt completely reasonable, and each sale severed a branch of the compounding tree that would never grow back. By the time both of them were old, the executive had a comfortable, respectable, several $1 million estate. The kind of estate a long, successful corporate career is supposed to produce. And Margaret Ellison, who had been paid a fraction of his wage and had never been promoted once, had more. Not a little more than he had, more than several of them had, more when the lawyer finally tallied it, than all of the executives at that funeral combined. There is one more number worth pausing on, because it is the number that turns this from a nice story into a genuinely useful one. The single most powerful variable in everything Margaret did was not the size of her paycheck, and it was not even the rate of return. It was the number of years, 51. If Margaret had run the exact same plan, same deductions, same reinvestment, same boring stock, but for 30 years instead of 51, she would not have ended with $7 to $12 million. She would have ended with perhaps $1.5. Still a fortune for a typist, but a fraction of what she actually had. The last 20 years of compounding produced more wealth than the first 31 combined. That is the cruel and beautiful arithmetic of patience. The reward for holding on is not linear. It is exponential, and almost nobody is willing to wait long enough to collect the steep part of the curve. And consider who in the entire company was structurally best positioned to wait that long. Not the executives. The executives were always one promotion, one move, one bigger opportunity from leaving. They changed companies, they cashed out, they retired to Florida and liquidated. The person most likely to still be holding the very same stock in the very same company 50 years later was the person nobody ever promoted, nobody ever recruited away, nobody ever thought worth moving. The typist, her invisibility was not just social, it was financial. The world left her alone long enough. For compounding to finish its work, what looked like being overlooked was in the only ledger that mattered, being left undisturbed. She did not do it by being smarter than them. She did it by wanting less and holding longer, and never once mistaking the wage for the wealth. It would be easy to make Margaret Ellison sound like a saint, and she was not. She was a private, particular, sometimes difficult woman who kept her own counsel to the point of loneliness. But there is a texture to her daily life that I think matters, because it shows you concretely what 50 years of discipline actually looks like from the inside. It does not look like sacrifice. It looks mostly like routine. She rose early. She walked to work in the same wool coat for the better part of 2 decades. A coat she had relined twice rather than replaced. She ate her lunch at her desk from a tin, the same few meals in rotation, year after year. She kept a small notebook. Not a diary, she had no interest in her own feelings, but a ledger. In it, in tiny, precise handwriting, she recorded every share she owned, every dividend she received, and every reinvestment the company made on her behalf. She balanced it by hand every quarter. For 51 years, she had no idea in any given year that she was becoming wealthy. That is not quite right. She knew the number in her ledger, of course. But the number lived only on those pages, and in her own head. It changed nothing about how she lived. She did not buy a car. She did not move to a finer house. She did not tell a soul. The neighbours thought of her, when they thought of her at all, as the quiet old retired secretary in the small house on the corner. The one who pinched pennies. The one they assumed had nothing. When she retired from the company after 51 years, there was a small cake in the break room and a card signed by people who did not know her. The executive team did not attend. One of them sent a memo which she typed herself, thanking her by the wrong first name. She corrected the name, typed it cleanly, mailed it for his signature, and never mentioned the error to anyone. She walked out of that building for the last time carrying a single cardboard box. And she was, on that grey afternoon, one of the largest individual owners of the company she was leaving. Not one person who watched her go had the faintest idea. People always want to know whether she was lonely. whether all that discipline, all that silence, all those decades of pinching and holding and saying nothing added up to a sad life. And I want to be careful here because the truth is complicated. She was, by any honest account, a solitary woman. She had few close friends and no immediate family by the end. But the lawyer who knew her for 30 years was adamant on one point. She was not unhappy. She had a purpose that almost no one around her possessed, and a quiet, private certainty about where her life was going. That most people never feel for a single day. She knew with total clarity what she was building and who it was for. And a person who knows that is harder to rattle, harder to tempt, and in some deep way harder to pity than a person who has everything except a reason. She had decided somewhere in those middle decades that her fortune would not be spent on herself because she did not want anything money could buy. What she wanted was for the lesson her father gave her on a porch, to outlive them both. She had watched for 50 years men with every advantage squander the one thing that actually built wealth: patience, while the people who could have benefited most from understanding it were never taught it at all. The machinists, the clerks, the typists, the people on the factory floor who had laughed at the stock plan in 1950 because no one had ever explained to them what they were laughing at. Margaret was going to explain it from beyond the grave, in the most unforgettable way she could devise. That was the plan, and the boardroom was only the opening scene. She lived more than 20 years past that retirement. Quiet years, ledger years. The dividends kept arriving, kept reinvesting, kept compounding, long after she had stopped earning a single dollar of wages. By the end, her position was generating more income every single year than she had earned across entire decades of typing. She spent almost none of it. She did not need to. She had everything she had ever actually wanted, which was very little, and a great deal of something she had decided long ago on a porch with her father to give away. Margaret Ellison died quietly in the small corner house in the spring of her 91st year. Her estate was handled by a local attorney she had used for decades. One of the very few people on earth who knew the truth before she died. And in her will she had left specific, unusual instructions. She wanted the value of her estate read aloud in person, in the boardroom of the company. To the executives, she had, it turned out, been planning this final scene for a very long time. So 3 weeks after the funeral that 6 people attended, the men who ran the company gathered in the wood-panelled room she had never been allowed to enter. They were irritated to be there. They assumed it was a formality, some small bequest from a sentimental old employee, a charity ask, a plaque to be hung. The lawyer set down his folder. He looked around the table at the most powerful men in the company, and he began to read. He read the share counts first, the long decimal tales of half a century of reinvested dividends. Hundreds of thousands of shares accumulated a handful at a time, quarter after quarter, since before most of the men in the room had been born. Then he read the valuation, and the room went silent. One of the executives asked the lawyer to repeat the figure. He repeated it. Another asked, with a thin and disbelieving laugh, whether there had been some mistake, whether a typist could possibly have owned that much of the company. And the lawyer, who had known Margaret Ellison for 30 years, and had loved her in the careful way she allowed, looked up from the folder. "There is no mistake," he said. "She owned more of this company than every person at this table combined. She began the year your stock plan opened, and unlike all of you, she never sold. Several of the men in that room had spent their entire careers believing they were the company, that the building, the brand, the machinery of it belonged to them by right of their titles and their salaries and their corner offices." And in a single sentence, an attorney for an $80 a week typist had quietly informed them that the woman whose name they could not remember had owned a larger piece of all of it than any of them ever had. She had been the largest shareholder in the room for years, and the room had never once let her in. The lawyer told me there was a long silence after that. The kind of silence, he said, that has a physical weight to it. And in that silence, the chief executive, the man who had handed her his empty coffee cup a dozen times without looking up, did something the lawyer never forgot. He asked, very quietly, almost to himself, which one was she? He could not place her. He had run the company she had quietly co-owned for 40 years. And he could not, in that moment, summon a single memory of her face. The lawyer opened the folder to a photograph Margaret had instructed him to bring. A plain black and white picture of a woman at a steno desk, taken decades earlier, entirely unremarkable. He turned it around and held it up to the room. And one by one, the men who had stepped past her for half a century finally looked at her. One of the younger executives, a man who had joined only a few years before she retired, said later that it was the most unsettling meeting of his career. Not because of the money exactly. The money was staggering, but money is abstract. What unsettled him was the realization that the firm's entire sense of its own hierarchy had been, in some quiet financial sense, a fiction. They had organized their whole world around who sat where, who was paid what, who was allowed into which room, and the actual ownership of the place. The real, legal dollars and cents ownership had been sitting in the hallway the entire time, in sensible shoes, typing their letters. The org chart and the cap table had told two completely different stories, and no one in the building had ever thought to read the second one. And then the lawyer turned the page and read what Margaret Ellison had decided to do with all of it. Because the will was never really about humiliating the executives. That was simply the price of admission she charged for the lesson. The real instructions came next. She left nothing to the executives, of course, but she did not keep it for herself either. And she had no children, no husband, no family who needed it. Instead, she directed nearly the entire fortune. The millions that 51 years of $80 paychecks had become, to the working people of the town that the company had built. And to one thing in particular, she endowed a fund permanently to teach the children of factory workers. The one thing her father had taught her on a porch at dusk: how ownership works, how compounding works, how the wage is what they pay you to show up, and the ownership is where the real money lives. She left money to the families of the men who had laughed at the stock plan in the break room in 1950, their children, their grandchildren. She left money to the typing pool that no longer existed in the form of scholarships for the clerical workers and the assistants and the overlooked staff of the company. The invisible people 3 desks from every boardroom in that town. She wrote in a clause, the lawyer read slowly and carefully, that she wanted them to know that the smallest paycheck in any building can quietly become the largest fortune in it if its owner simply refuses to let go. The executives left that boardroom changed men. Not better men, necessarily, but quieter ones. Every one of them had spent a career stepping past a desk 3 doors away, and not one of them had ever thought to ask the woman behind it a single real question. She had been the richest person in their building, and the most invisible, at the exact same time for decades. She had let them believe she was furniture, and she had used the silence they gave her to quietly buy the floor beneath their feet. Now, what does Margaret Ellison's story actually teach us? Lesson 1. The wage is not the wealth. This is the lesson Margaret's father gave her on a porch, and it is the lesson that underwrites everything else. Your salary is what you are paid to show up. It is necessary, and it is not enough, and it will almost never make you rich on its own. Real, durable, multi-decade wealth comes from owning things that grow, businesses through their stock, and from owning them for so long that time does the work your paycheck never could. Lesson 2. Take the ownership they offer the small, the stock purchase plan, the employer match, the shares nobody on the floor wanted. These things are often offered most freely to the people with the least power, precisely because the powerful assume the small will never hold on to them. If your employer offers you a piece of the company through a stock plan, a retirement match, an ownership program, take the maximum you possibly can. Margaret's entire fortune began as the crumbs the executives expected her to refuse. Lesson 3. Reinvest everything. Margaret never spent a dividend during her working life. Every cash payment the company sent her, she fed straight back into more shares automatically through a reinvestment plan for 51 years. That single choice, made once and then never reversed, is responsible for the overwhelming majority of her final fortune. Find the setting in your own account that says automatically reinvest dividends. Turn it on, then forget it exists. Lesson 4. Never sell what you mean to keep. The executives sold, they sold in fear, they sold for boats, they sold to feel rich today. And every sale cut a branch off a tree that would have fed them for life. Margaret sold nothing, through 3 crashes, through decades of headlines screaming at her to run. She sat. If you have chosen well and bought patiently, the hardest and most valuable thing you will ever do is absolutely nothing. Lesson 5. Let them underestimate you. Margaret Ellison turned invisibility into a weapon. She did not announce her plan, did not boast of her holdings, did not let a single executive suspect what she was building 3 desks from their door. The discipline to compound for 50 years is, in part, the discipline of not needing anyone to know you are winning. The world will hand quiet, underestimated people enormous room to operate. Margaret took every inch of it. And I want to put a sharp practical point on that lesson, because let them underestimate you can sound like mere attitude, and it is much more than that. The people who blow up their wealth are very often the people who feel a need to display it. The new car that signals success, the bigger house that announces you have arrived, the trades you make so you have something impressive to say at dinner. Every one of those impulses is the enemy of compounding. Margaret had no audience, so she had no performances. She never once had to spend $1 or sell a share, or take a risk, for the sake of how it would look to someone else. Because no one was looking. Her invisibility removed the single most expensive temptation in all of personal finance. The temptation to be seen winning. If you can build the discipline to compound quietly, without applause, you will keep money that louder, prouder, more impressive people hemorrhage their entire lives. Lesson 6. Know what it is all for. Margaret knew for decades before she died exactly where her fortune was going. She was not accumulating to win. She was accumulating to teach, to hand the next generation of overlooked clerks and floor workers the single insight that had changed her own life. That clarity of purpose is almost certainly what let her hold the line for 51 years. When you know what the money is for, the discipline stops feeling like deprivation and starts feeling like devotion. And one final lesson, which I think is the truest of them all. Margaret Ellison did not look like wealth. For half a century, the most powerful people in her world looked directly at her and saw nothing worth remembering. They saw a typist, they saw furniture, they saw the help. And beneath the relined coat and the $80 paychecks and the tin of lunch at her desk, she was quietly assembling more ownership of their entire world than any of them would ever hold. The most invisible person in the building was the richest, she just never told them. And that silence was the whole point. Margaret Ellison was paid $80 a week to be invisible. So she became invisible. And from inside that invisibility, from a plain steno desk 3 doors from a boardroom, she was never allowed to enter. She did something none of the powerful men around her had the patience or the temperament to do. She took the ownership they handed the small. She reinvested every dividend it ever paid. She held it through every crash that ever came. And she did it for 51 years without telling a living soul. When the lawyer read her estate aloud in that boardroom, the men who had stepped past her for a lifetime finally learned her name, and learned in the same breath that she had quietly owned more of their world than all of them combined. 2 things about Margaret Ellison anyone in that building could have seen: the plain coat, the plain desk. The third thing, the one that mattered, was invisible, hidden for half a century behind a quiet woman's quiet life. When the executors opened her folder and finally understood, more than one of them had to look away. There is a temptation, hearing a story like this, to treat it as a fairy tale. A charming once-in-a-century fluke, the lottery ticket of a strange and frugal woman. Something that could never happen to ordinary people like us. I want to take that comfort away from you, because it is a lie. And it is the most expensive lie in this entire film. Margaret Ellison did nothing you cannot do. She bought boring stock. She reinvested the dividends. She refused to sell. She did it for a very long time. Every single one of those steps is available to almost any working person in this country today. More available now, in fact, than it ever was for her, because the tools she had to assemble by hand, with payroll forms and mailed certificates, and a ledger balanced under a lamp, now take about 4 clicks to set up and then run themselves forever. The only thing she had that is genuinely rare is the one thing no app can install for you: the patience. The willingness to be bored and overlooked and unspectacular. For decades, while the arithmetic does what arithmetic does, we talk a great deal in modern life about status, about titles and corner offices, and who is allowed into which room. All of it feels permanent and important while you are inside it. But the quiet truth, the one the boardroom almost never tells because it cannot afford to, is that the person serving the coffee may be building in total silence a fortune the people drinking it will never touch. Status is loud. Ownership is quiet. And in the end, across a long enough life, ownership wins. If there is a North Star in this channel, a single thesis we return to in every story we tell, it is this: ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary patience build slow fortunes. Sometimes they build them 3 desks from the people who never bothered to ask their names. More of them exist than the world ever notices. And every so often, when a folder is finally opened and a number is finally read aloud, the world has to sit very still and reckon with one of them. If you want more stories like this one, stories of the overlooked, the underestimated, and the quietly, secretly rich, subscribe. There is a Margaret Ellison in almost every building. We are only getting started finding them.